Dr. Raphaël Millière is the 2020 Robert A. Burt Presidential Scholar in Society and Neuroscience in the Center of Science and Society and a lecturer at the Philosophy Department at Columbia University. His research focuses on understanding the capacities and limitations of deep artificial neural networks, as well as investigating the nature and scope of self-representation. Drawing on his expertise in philosophy and cognitive science, Dr. Millière is exploring the implications of recent progress in deep learning for models of human cognition, as well as various issues in ethics and aesthetics. He's also investigating what underlies the capacity to represent oneself as oneself at the fundamental level in humans and non-human animals, as well as the role that self-representation plays in perception, action, and memory. In a world where technology is rapidly advancing, Dr. Millière is striving to gain a better understanding of how artificial neural networks work and establish fair and meaningful comparisons between humans and machines. By doing so, he hopes to shed light on the implications of artificial intelligence for our lives. Imagine chatting with an artificial intelligence about various topics and feeling it was a real interaction. What would it mean to feel real? Would passing the Turing test suffice? Or would you really like to know for sure that an agent on the other side has autonomy and feeling? Raphael asserted in his Moving Beyond Mimicry in Artificial Intelligence article last year that what was once science fiction is becoming reality. Raphael said that in June, Google engineer Blake Lemoine told the Washington Post that he was convinced that Google AI's chatbot, Lambda, was sentient. "I know a person when I talk to it," Lemoine said. Therein lies the rub. As algorithms are getting increasingly good at producing the kind of outputs that we once thought were distinctly human, it's easy to get dazzled. Like Narcissus, we get lost gazing at the reflection, even though it's not always flattering. Raphael said that we ought to ask ourselves, is there more to these algorithms than mindless copy? The answer is not straightforward. Raphael said that some large pre-trained models are trained exclusively on text. In just a few years, these models have shown an uncanny ability to write coherent paragraphs, explain jokes, and even solve math problems. He went on. Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, and colleagues compared language models to stochastic parrots, alleging that they haphazardly stitched together samples from their training data. Parrots repeat phrases without understanding what they mean. Raphael said that ongoing debates about whether large pre-trained models understand text and images are complicated by the fact that scientists and philosophers themselves disagree about the nature of linguistic and visual understanding in creatures like us. Many researchers have emphasized the importance of grounding for understanding, but this term can encompass a number of different ideas. These might include having appropriate connections between linguistic and perceptual representations, anchoring these in the real world through causal interactions, and modeling communicative intentions. Now, some have the intuition that true understanding requires consciousness, while others prefer to think of these two as distinct issues. So it's no surprise that there's a looming risk of researchers talking past each other. It's hard to deny that large pre-trained models don't understand language or the world in the same way humans do. We must understand the difference, as AI evangelists often portray these models as having magical abilities or being close to reaching human-level general intelligence. This misleads people and can lead to inflated expectations. We must be mindful of the ethical implications of deploying large pre-trained models at scale, and we must remember that humans never stop learning, forming persistent goals or desires or beliefs and memories, all of which are still largely missing in AI models. Have you ever wondered how large pre-trained models are able to produce such impressive outputs? Many assume that these models simply memorize sequences from their training data, but there's ample evidence to suggest that this is not the case. In fact, these models are capable of producing novel sentences and images that were never seen before. Raphael said that we can even call them stochastic chameleons. as they're now able to seamlessly blend in environments and adapt to the context and tone and style of virtually any prompt. However, this ability to mimic also comes with risks. These models are prone to mimicking the worst aspects of humanity, including racist, sexist, and hateful outputs. Raphael said that they can be excellent at bullshitting, as they have no intrinsic regard for truth or falsity. Raphael pointed out the elephant in the room when it comes to mimicry. He said that it need not involve intelligence or even agency. The specialized pigment-containing cells through which chameleons and cephalopods blend in their environment may seem clever, but they don't require them to intentionally imitate features of their surroundings through careful analysis. The sophisticated eyes of the cuttlefish, which capture subtle color shades of the surroundings and reproduce them on the cuttlefish's skin, is a kind of biological mimicry that can be seen as solving a matching problem, one that involves sampling the right region of the color space based on the context. He said that sufficiently advanced mimicry is virtually indistinguishable from intelligent behavior, and therein lies the problem. When scaled-up models unlock new capabilities, combining novel concepts coherently, explaining new jokes to our satisfaction, or working through a math problem step by step to give the correct solution, it's hard to resist the intuition that there's something more than mindless mimicry going on here. So what can we do? We must be mindful of the capacities, the limitations, and potential risks of large pre-trained models. We must also be aware of the power of artificial mimicry and how it can be used for good and bad. Only then can we ensure that these models are being used responsibly and can continue to benefit society. Enjoy the show. Raphael, it's an absolute honor to have you on MLST. I've been following your work with great interest. I love your Twitter posts. Honestly, welcome to MLST. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've been listening to many episodes over the years, so it's great to be here. So I'm interested broadly in how we can gain a better understanding of deep neural networks and how we can establish meaningful but also fair comparisons between these networks and human cognition in various domains, such as language understanding, reasoning, planning, perception, and so on. And these comparisons go both ways, of course. So I'm interested in whether there are ways in which these networks might be human-like in terms of the kinds of cognitive psychological capacities we can ascribe to them. But, also I'm interested in whether we can take inspiration from recent work in deep learning to perhaps update certain ideas in cognitive science about models of human cognition.
Amazing. Okay. And what's interesting to me is I started out as a machine learning person. And as many of the audience have seen, very, very quickly you go down the rabbit hole and you start getting into cognitive science and philosophy. And there are so many really, really deep questions, actually. And there are so many intersectional fields that have interesting answers to some of the questions that we're going to be asking. But why don't we start the conversation by talking about large language models? Now, I guess I'm just going to hit you straight with the killer question. Do you think they are stochastic parrots, or do you think at this point it's a gross trivialization to say so?
So just for contextualization, you're referring to the stochastic parrots phrase, which came out of this paper by Emily Bender and colleagues, and to some extent elaborate some ideas that were already expressed in a previous paper by Bender and Kohler, Climbing Towards NLU, in which they suggested that large language models cannot learn anything about meaning, and essentially what they're doing is just parroting the strings of text in the training data, so they're haphazardly stitching together bits from the training data as they put it in the stochastic parrots paper. I do not think that's a fair characterization of language models, as you probably know. I think it's a tricky question because I think I do get the impetus to resist inflated claims about what language models can do. And I think it's important to push back against some of the more extravagant claims coming from AI hype and various sweeping statements about language models being at the very edge of artificial general human level intelligence and the like. But I do think there is a lot of fertile ground in between the very inflationary claims about what language models are and can do, like the stochastic parrots claim, and the more inflationary, extravagant claims of like the one I just mentioned. And so that's kind of the thread that runs through my own work, is to try to explore that in between. I think reducing language model stochastic parrots is problematic because you can probably show that what they do is not just memorization, it's not just stitching together samples from the training data. It's fairly easy to show that they can produce novel outputs. I also think that it's not quite right to make a differentiatory statement on the basis of the claim that they only do next word prediction, for example, or people say sometimes they just do autocomplete. Well, it's true. The learning objective is next word prediction, right? Of course, they learn this joint statistical distribution of words, but we shouldn't confuse the learning objective with whatever processing is happening inside the network to achieve that objective, specifically the computations that are induced during training in order to reach that objective. So what I'm more interested in is finding more about these computations and thinking about how they might relate to the kinds of computations we can ascribe to humans, or perhaps not human animals, where they engage in various cognitive capacities like reasoning or planning or thinking or understanding.
Yeah, it's so difficult to come at this because, I mean, first of all, I was thinking to myself the other day that it's almost like as a species, we weren't supposed to develop large language models. It's just insane, you know, like we've kind of, by using this technology that we barely understand and nudging and working at scale and using computation, we've developed these artifacts that we don't really understand. And as you say, they're doing next token prediction, but it could be argued that they are learning some kind of a world model. And that's something we can discuss. We could mechanistically look at the architectural priors. They're using these self-attention, transformers, and they look at a certain type of permutation invariance between pairs of tokens. And we could look at the emergent capabilities. We could look at the lack of capabilities. We'll talk about Felician and Foda's connectionism critique paper later. But you could look at the class of language model from a Chomsky point of view. There's so many different positives and negatives, but we are where we are. They are incredible, and they do things that are very surprising.
Yes, I think they definitely do things that are very surprising, and sometimes we get used to that. But if we look back 10 years ago, no one would have expected that just training a statistical model on next word prediction and a large corpus would achieve this kind of capability. And again, I think it's important to, take a step back from just considering the learning objective and the architecture itself, and be more open-minded about what might emerge from the repertoire of computations induced during training, which is what a lot of researchers today are trying to find out with mechanistic interpretability to work, for example, looking at trained models and trying to reverse engineer what's happening inside them. But just knowing everything you can know about the architecture of the model, the transformer, before it's trained, and the learning objective is not going to tell you what kind of capacity you can ascribe to a trained model. I think that's the important point.
Interesting. I mean, there's another few things that we'll get to later in the conversation, but for example, the symbol grounding problem, for example, the lack of analogy making. And actually, if you look at many disciplines in philosophy, like structuralism, there are so many, I guess what I'm saying is like meaning is about recognizing the sounds that are not being made in the music, right? There's the missing information problem. And what we do as humans is we kind of create information to fill in the gaps where the music isn't playing. And it feels like language models don't do that.
Yes, there are a lot of things to be said about meaning and language models. To be clear, just to qualify my previous statements, I'm not saying that there is nothing we can infer from considerations of the architecture of the models and their learning objective about what kinds of capacities they may, in principle, acquire. Obviously, a language model that is trained on text only will never acquire perceptual capacity, strictly speaking, right? So there are things like that we can obviously infer from this kind of consideration. What I'm talking about is more the most maybe less rigorously defined and more contentious psychological capacities or human-like cognitive capacities that are in debate when it comes to language models, such as capacity to do some forms of reasoning, or indeed capacity to understand language to some extent. And that's where the meaning question comes in. And I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I think, yes, it's important. Once we establish that these models are trained on text only, for the ones that are just autoregressive transformers trained on text, we can rule out certain capacities that by definition they cannot acquire, but there still leaves open a lot of room for discussion about what they might be doing in order to achieve next word prediction.
Yeah, I'm interested to know how much of a receding horizon you think it is. I mean, I spoke to Murray Shanahan recently, and he had a paper out about language models, and he was quite clear that they do have emergent reasoning, and we can talk about whether it is still reasoning if you have to kind of create the prompt yourself to tell it how to reason. But he was quite clear that, I mean, like Searle, he invoked Dennett's intentional stance, for example, and we'll talk about theory of mind, but I think the theory of mind is somewhere halfway on the horizon where we possibly could think of language models as being, agents who understand the beliefs and states of mind of others. But John Searle would say that this kind of phenomenal experience or subjective experience is something completely divorced from the form of language.
Yes, I think it's important to keep certain questions separate. One of which is, can we ascribe any consciousness to large language models? This is a very infamous question that has come into the public consciousness, no pun intended, recently with the Lambda story of Blake Lemoine, but has also attracted some interest from researchers like David Chalmers, among others. That's a question that I think is very hard to settle for various reasons, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. But I think it comes apart from questions about whether language models. I'm reluctant to use the term understand because it also comes bundled up with a lot of connotations, including the assumption that to understand language, one might need to be conscious, which was Searle's assumption.
Yes.
So I'm trying to resist that assumption, and that's why I prefer to talk about semantic competence in language models, for example. So how much can they induce about the semantics of words and sentences during training, regardless of what we think about whether they're conscious. For the record, I don't think we can ascribe meaningfully conscious experience to language models, but the full story would be that it's impossible to know for sure. It's just a very, very strong implausibility claim.
Could you introduce semantic competence and also I know you're reticent to do this, but I'm really fascinated by the space of possible minds and the space of possible understandings. So we can accept that there are different minds and different forms of understanding, and Melanie Mitchell put a paper out recently talking about different modes of understanding. And then some modes are more compatible with humans than others. So even if it is a legitimate mode of understanding, is it a useful mode of understanding if it's different to us and therefore unreliable?
Yeah, so the term understanding, I think, is somewhat unhelpful in some contexts, unless we make these distinctions, because, as I said, first of all, it tends to bundle up several things like semantic competence and consciousness, but also it tends to apply to different domains. So we can talk about understanding for semantic competence when it comes to language. We can also talk about visual understanding the scene through perceptual capacities. And we can talk about understanding also in more abstract ways that might be also non-linguistics, perhaps. So one might talk about having an understanding of, a certain feeling or something like that. What about semantic competence specifically? I think it's also helpful to break it apart as a concept. So generally, when you think of linguistic competence, that refers to the kinds of capacities that a language user has to be a competent user of that language, to make use of that language in a way that satisfies certain standards of use, and that involves syntactic competence, so a certain ability to parse and apply grammatical rules or the syntactic structures that are found in a given language. And here there would be various also further subtle distinctions about competence in the Chomskyan sense, which is something a little bit more even abstract than competence in any given particular language, but I'll leave that aside. And so there is syntactic competence, and there is semantic competence, which pertains to the capacity to grasp the meaning of linguistic expressions. And semantic competence comes apart into lexical competence, about the capacity to grasp the meaning of words, and structural or compositional competence, which refers to the capacity to understand the meaning of or grasp the meaning of complex expressions, so sentences and paragraphs and so on. And obviously there is a lot of overlap between syntactic competence and structural semantic competence, because in order to parse the meaning of complex expressions, you need to be able to parse the syntactic structure of such expressions. But if you focus on word meanings for a second, because that's perhaps the case that's been most discussed when it comes to understanding in language models, there is one notion of lexical semantic competence which appeals to the capacity to grasp the reference of words in the world, right? Which is the notion that someone like Emily Bender and her co-authors in the Climbing Towards Natural Language Understanding paper or the Stochastic Parts paper generally appeal to. So this is reflected in my ability to, for example, name objects in the world. So I can point to this and say, this is a smartphone. I can hunt to this and say, this is an octopus. I'm also capable of responding to instructions you give me in natural language to perform actions in the world. So you can tell me, go and fetch the red pen on the table. I can do that. So that's this referential notion of lexical semantic competence. There is another notion, which is the inferential notion of semantic competence, which pertains to our capacities to relate words with each other. For example, through definitions or through analogies, and through various other ways in which we're able to form meaningful connections between words. And once we make that kind of distinction, things get a little bit clearer when it comes to discussions of semantic competence, again, as a substitute for understanding, generally speaking, in AI models generally. So in classical symbolic models, think of SHR-DLU from Terry Winograd, end of the 60s, early 70s. It's a system that could receive natural language instructions and could parse these natural language strings, and then in response to them perform operations in a virtual world called the blocks world, where there were various geometrical shapes like blocks and triangles, pyramids, and so on, that had different colors and locations. And so CHR-DLU was a system that was capable to, in response to the sequence, pick up the red block and place it on top of the blue block, for example, could parse these instructions and perform these actions in the virtual environments. So you could say that a system like this, in some sense, has a form of referential lexical semantic competence, because it is capable to map the symbols that are given in the linguistic input onto objects not in the real world, but a virtual world in that case. Except that the semantics here is totally baked in by programmers. So it's not induced in any way from experience in this world, from interacting with this world. It's just hard-coded into the program. But nonetheless, it is a form of referential competence. It's able to to do things with language in that world, or to respond to language in that virtual world. And you could think of language models as leaning towards having the opposite kinds of competence. So CHRDLU has this kind of referential semantic competence. It has little to no inferential semantic competence, because it's not really able to do things like reasoning about analogies. It's able to do limited inferences from language to language based on baked-in rules, but that's very limited. By contrast, language models, because they're trained on this statistical learning objective, and essentially they learn they learn complex patterns of co-occurrence statistics in language. Not only just first-order statistics, co-occurrence statistics like bigrams or n-grams, but also second-order co-occurrence statistics, like which words tend to occur in the same context. Perhaps apple and pear tend to both appear near pie, and so on. And even higher-order patterns of co-occurrence statistics that become very hard for us to wrap our head around, but map onto very complex dependencies between words that we don't even think about when we use language. And that enables these models to induce a lot of information about how words relate to each other within language based on their use in various ways. And we know that, of course, they do this by mapping words onto vectors in very high dimensional vector spaces, where the proximity of these vectors can be adjusted during training to reflect these along these many dimensions that are not human interpretable, to reflect these patterns of statistical relationship between words. So we could say that language models have a really significant degree of inferential lexical semantic competence, and by contrast, the charge that is put forward against these models by people like Emily Bender is that they have a very limited, perhaps not any form of referential lexical semantic competence. I would perhaps also push back against that second claim to some extent, but I think the gist of this characterization is correct.
Yeah, and you've used slightly different language to how I would have described that, but I completely agree. So this second mode, this referential ability, and I would say that, abstractions are a meta-relation between data, not only words, because there are so many things we need to frame up here. Because if it's only words, then that's subscribing to Foda's view of the language of thought, which is that, the words are the first-class citizen of thought. And I don't think you believe that. We have visual understanding, we have different modes of understanding, some of which are not verbalizable. And then there's all of the different forms of grounding. Now, John Searle, I really like the way he framed this up. He said that there's ontologically subjective and objective, and epistemically objective and subjective. And this kind of speaks to some of the different modalities of mapping. And then there's the symbol grounding problem, which sort of leads to how these symbols are grounded to things in physical reality. And abstractions, of course, by definition, aren't grounded to anything in physical reality. And then some things are grounded to things in social reality, or in some, kind of emergent reality. And then we have pragmatics as well, which is this kind of notion that there might be things outside of everything we just spoke about, or there might be some kind of social consensus, or, sophisticated game of charades around how we derive meaning based on its use. So you can see this is a very, very complex, nebulous topic to speak to.
Yes, it's definitely a very complex question, partially because also it's these systems, language models, are still very new. We don't yet fully understand them, and mapping some old discussions about meaning onto these systems is not always straightforward. But there is this thread that runs, from the late Wittgenstein to structural linguistics in the 1950s, with the work of J.R. Firth, for example. You shall know a word by the company it keeps. So this idea that came to be known as the distributional hypothesis, and then gave rise to distributional semantics and distributional semantics models, all the way to modern language models. That's the thread that focuses on the inferential side of semantics, the distributional relationships between words as being a key aspect of the meaning of words. essentially the idea being that by looking at the context in which a word appears in a sufficiently large corpora, you should be able to induce what that word means in this context.
Okay, but to pick up on that, so why don't we bring in Melanie Mitchell has written a lot about forming analogies, and she's very careful to use the word forming, because large language models, the mimicry is so impressive that you would be forgiven for thinking that they already have the ability to use analogies, and that's because they're a materialized snapshot of the result of the language game and the result of all of this, evolution and maturation in society and our use of language and so on. But they can't form analogies. And she used an example of on top of as being a great analogy. So she's on top of her game, or he's on top of the television. And this is a great example of it's not in the data, right? It's the missing information problem. So you need to have an architecture that, I don't know whether it needs to, and by the way, this is one of the fundamental problems in AI, which is that do you have a blank slate and do you let intelligence emerge, or do you kind of seed it with base cognitive priors and, of which all of your abstractions and various cognitive capabilities are deducible from those priors through some kind of search or creative process. And this is the problem, because we know that large language models are, I don't want to use the word interpolators, but they are basically ways of compressing, decomposing, representing what already exists. And we know that forming analogies is a kind of it's a creative process. You're creating something that doesn't already exist.
Yeah, I think that touches on a really deep set of questions about what language models are really doing. That is perhaps a bit more nuanced than just the debate of whether they are just doing next word prediction. Because again, I think in the process of doing next word prediction, as well as they do virtually any linguistic context, you have to end up acquiring certain sophisticated capacities. But I think the question here is, are they just, you mentioned interpolation. There is this, I remember this whole discussion about whether interpolation in high enough dimensional space is equivalent to some kind of extrapolation. There's this paper by, I think, Yann LeCun about this.
Yeah.
I know François Chollet has a very different view on this. And to some extent, I think it relates to this discussion about compression in language models. So there was this recent Ted Cheng article, I think in the New York Times, that talked about compression in relation to language models. And, it's brilliantly written, as always, with Ted Cheng. But I had some slight concerns about the way in which the analogy is set up in that particular piece. Of course, it's a general audience piece, not a research paper, but he's trying to explain what ChatGPT does by saying it's essentially like a blurry JPEG of the web. So it's trained on all of this data scraped from the web. And essentially, what it's doing is it's just compressing that information in a way that is lossy. So it's a form of lossy compression in his view, and then just regurgitating a degraded version of that database and that lossy compression that he compares to interpolation in pixel space when you do, say, JPEG decompression. So I think there are some parts of these analogies that are right and some others that are wrong. So it's pumping some good intuitions and some unhelpful intuitions, I think. So there is obviously a very interesting and deep analogy or relationship between compression and statistical language modeling. And it is true that in the process of learning from this next word prediction objective, the model will end up inducing some structure in the data that affords some capacity to compress the information contained in the data, including things like syntactic rules, for example, like grammatical rules or things. I don't think, however, that generation with so inference with the language model is anything like decompression, lossy decompression with image decompression, for example. When you're sampling from a language model, you're not just trying to regurgitate the training data, but in a lossy manner, right? There is memorization that does happen, but that's not the only thing that language models are doing. That relates again to the idea that are they just stochastic parrots? Are they just regurgitating haphazardly or stitching together bits and pieces from the training data? I don't think they are, and I think it's. I mean, there's a lot of research on memorization that shows that they are not just doing memorization. If your goal was just to memorize the training data, then the most efficient way to do this is just to take the training data and directly do some kind of similarity search and regurgitate pieces from the training data, and they're doing something different. I recently listened to this interesting talk by Jack Ray from OpenAI about compression. That he touches on text piece, but he has this interesting idea that you can actually think of large language models in an idealized scenario as perfect lossless compressors rather than lossy compressors. And the idea here is that the compression that is happening is very much related to the capacity of language models to generalize instead of just memorizing. Because in order to learn to compress the training data as efficiently as possible, these models need to learn the patterns, the generative patterns that underlie that training data, which enable these models to generalize to out of distribution generative tasks. So I think there is a meaningful relationship between compression and language models, and I think it's very intriguing to think of generalization and lossless compression as being related. And Jack Ray does this in the context of a discussion of minimum description length and information theory that is very interesting. But I think the lossy compression analogy with a blurry JPEG is unhelpful because, again, it harks back to this idea that language models are only memorizing and they are incapable of generalizing.
I wouldn't say they're incapable of generalizing. I mean, first of all, on your point on generalization, the problem with machine learning is it kind of does everything. It learns a spectrum of correlations, and the correlations we want are the OOD ones. But most of them, unfortunately, are kind of overfit to the sample that we train on. And there's an interesting spectrum. I've seen it visualized in a couple of papers. But yeah, so the problem is we're talking about something which is just completely unintelligible. You started off by speaking about interpolation. And interpolation is something that only makes sense in about 2 or 3 dimensions. Actually, if you look at Euclidean spaces in general, 3, 4, 5 dimensions, the behavior changes dramatically. We have the cursive dimensionality. And actually, interpolation is a concept that doesn't really exist in high dimensions. It's a very vague concept, and no one has a good definition for it. And we've spoken about this at great length on several MLST episodes. And it's the same thing with compression, because, Walid Sabah says to me the reason why large language models are not NLU is because they're compression algorithms, and NLU is inherently a form of decompression. It's disambiguating the meaning out of all of the possible meanings. But I would argue again that when you have these very large scale models, look at Stable Diffusion, right? Look at it. It's cutting and gluing, and people say, oh no, the deep learning model, it's learning the intrinsic manifold of the data. No, it's not. It's approximating it. To a certain extent, these models are just cutting and gluing, and they're learning the surface statistics of billions of tokens, and it's something which is just beyond our comprehension. So it's so difficult for us to really, speak authoritatively about it.
I think there is a lot of room for middle ground views between the idea that language models are perfectly inducing, the underlying manifold of the training data, and the idea that just cutting and gluing, right? And again, that's generally I'm what I try to do when I approach these topics is articulate this middle ground, because people tend to really very much get polarized on these on extreme, the 2 extremes of the spectrum. So look, Stable Diffusion, for example, you can provably use it for lossy compression, that's true, right? So there was this blog post that was doing this, so you can just use the model weights as a way to perform lossy compression in a way that's significantly more efficient than, say, JPEG or even other compression formats. But of course, you will get the occasional hallucination, or it can be very lossy in the way the image is decompressed. But you can do that. But I don't think any instance of running inference on stable diffusion, if you want to take that example, is an instance of that. So there's only a very specific set of cases in which you're explicitly doing something like that. And you might obviously have some generations from the model that are very, very similar to samples from the training data. But you can also do some generate some things that seem to generalize non-trivially from what's presented in the training data. So a very minimal basic example that I played around at the beginning when DALL-E 2 came out was with conceptual combinations, so combining certain concepts. I mean, everyone knows by now the avocado chair, but the avocado chair is not a good example because presumably, there might be some examples of avocado chairs in the training data. I mean, it's not. I actually haven't double checked, but I'm sure some designers somewhere have actually designed some chairs looking like avocados, and so this particular combination probably was somewhere in there. But you can think of more random combinations and people have been generating some wild images with these models. It's very implausible to think that all of these possible combinations that combine visual concepts that would really never be combined in the training data can be accounted for in terms of just gluing and stitching. I mean, the gluing and stitching, the way in which some people who are pushing back against AI art, for example, for copyright concerns, the way in which some people think about this is literally just, doing some kind of collage of taking a face from that bit of the training sample and body from that bit and the background. And of course, that's not in the vast majority of cases what's happening. It's definitely not literally what's happening, but it's also not what you will rarely find images that can neatly map like this onto bits and pieces from different training samples. What you might find instead is images that seem to have induced properties from different training samples, the style of some parts of the set training data, and the shape of an object from a different sample from the training data. But that's not just gluing and stitching in a trivial sense, right? So that's already something more.
Well, I mean, maybe I should clarify a little bit. I don't have any problem with cutting and gluing. I don't think saying that stable diffusion is cutting and gluing is in any way an indictment of stable diffusion. The reason it doesn't understand has got nothing to do with it cutting and gluing. The reason it doesn't understand, as you said earlier, is it doesn't have these meta relations between concepts that don't exist in the data. If it had that information and it cut and glue, then it would work as far as I'm concerned.
Right. But I still don't, I'm not sure the cut and glue analogy is the right one, because it evokes these collages that are not quite how it seems that these models actually work. Perhaps in the linguistic case, it's more clear cut, because you can actually test, say, compositional generalization. We have some synthetic data sets that have been used, like SCAN and others, COGS. So the Taulin's and the one you has done all the work on this. So you have a synthetic data set that are designed in such a way that the only way for a model to perform well is to generalize compositionally from the train set to the test set. Because the problem when you assess the capacities of language models just train on natural data or natural language data, like this massive corpora that big models are trained on, all of Common Crawl and Wikipedia and thousands of books, is that basically virtually any syntactic constructions will appear in the training data, and therefore it's hard to know whether when it's generating perfectly grammatical sentences and with virtually any kind of syntactic construction, it's not doing anything more than, as you say, cutting or gluing in some sense. But if you look at performance on these compositional generalization datasets, the picture that emerges is a bit more nuanced. So vanilla transformers and LSTMs, for that matter, don't do perfectly. They fall short of human performance on most of these benchmarks. But there have been a lot of work to try to introduce some tweaks to the vanilla transformer architecture, maybe change the type of positional encoding, or introduce other tweaks that seem to significantly strengthen their capacity to generalize compositionally from the test set to the train set to the test set. So that's a case where, if the model is generalizing compositionally, which is provable by just looking at the performance on the test set, I don't think it's meaningful to characterize it as just, cutting and gluing.
Yeah, and I really don't think of that as being a pejorative statement. And so much of this is about what's intelligible to us. I think that there are many different paths to intelligence. And the paths that can be traversed through a large language model are defined by the way we optimize them and the architectural priors and so on. And if the priors do cutting and gluing, and there is a path to intelligence traversable through that framework, then as far as I'm concerned, I mean, we'll get to what is intelligence later, because so many of the conceptions are based on behavior. If it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And I hate that. But unfortunately, it's undeniable, because there are so many different ways of producing intelligence. And if you say that you need this particular mechanism to produce intelligence, then, that's just not a very strong argument. But we'll get to that in a minute. Maybe we should move to just compositionality in general. So this is kind of like, I think of this as being very related to the idea of systematicity that was, coined by Fodor and Polishin in their 1988 connectionism critique, and they also spoke about productivity. But maybe you could just kind of like speak for a minute, just kind of introducing what they were saying about systematicity.
Yeah, so Fodor and Polishin and other philosophers at the time pointed out that our capacity to produce linguistic expression is regimented by certain phenomena, such as the fact that we are able, in principle, to produce expressions of indefinite length or indefinitely novel and complex expressions just by recursion, for example. That's the productivity of language. So I can say, John's father likes apples, and I can say John's father's father like apples, and then just by recursion create more and more complex sentences of that type ad infinitum if I weren't limited by other contingent limitations such as working memory limitations and so on. So that's the productivity of language, and there is this other phenomena that was pointed out, discussed at the time heavily, which is the systematicity of language, namely that if one is able to understand the sentence, John loves Mary, it seems that we should also be able to understand the sentence, Mary loves John. So there are these systematic connections between the kinds of linguistic expressions and linguistic structure we're able to parse that also relates to the kinds of inferences we're able to make based on linguistic inputs. So that's a phenomenon that we find in language, and that's a phenomenon that people like Fodor have argued is also a characteristic of thought. So a thought is also productive in the same way. I can think of indefinitely many thoughts in the same way, so it's productive. It's also systematic because it also has this systematic connections that govern the way in which our capacity to think certain thoughts.
Fodor, of course, he pointed out that language, has productivity and systematicity. And it's completely natural to make the leap and say, well, language is the system of thought. I'm not so sure that the world we live in is systematic. And that's why I'm skeptical that you can take something like AlphaGo and apply it in the real world. And would it be systematic in the same way? But the reason why this is interesting to bring in after what we were just speaking about previously is the whole point of that connectionism critique paper is to talk about a capability which is not achievable with connectionist or with neural network models. And you were just saying that you produced this this conceptual combinations task on Bigbench, and it appeared to be, it's a receding horizon, but it appeared to be working reasonably well. And there's two explanations here. I mean, first of all, there's the shortcut rule. We were just talking about the spectrum of correlations, and most of them are spurious. Most of them aren't the ones that we want. So it could have been cheating. Or it could have been the fact that it is actually possible to achieve these capabilities with these, neural network models. But the whole point of that paper was to show that it's theoretically impossible to do this kind of, systematicity and that kind of generalization with deep learning models. So which is it?
Yeah, so there's a lot here, I think, to unpack. So the first thing I would say is that the language of thought hypothesis comes apart from the claim that we think in language, or even that we need language to think. So it's more of a claim about the structure of cognition in terms of the format of the representations that are manipulated when we think, and the way in which these representations are manipulated. So here is how we move from productivity and systematicity to that. The idea is that for a thinker to think in ways that are systematic and productive, that thinker must be able to parse and process representations compositionally, meaning that it must be able to... So compositionality in language is the phenomenon or the principle. There's this canonical formulation from Barbara Party in Linguistics, the idea that the meaning of complex expressions is determined by the meaning of the elements of that expression. So, for example, the words that make up that expression together with the syntactic structure of that expression, so the way in which these words are combined in the expression. We could talk about composition for hours in the linguistic domain. There are reasons to think that lateral language is not strictly compositional in that sense, because there are various phenomena like idioms and others, extra linguistic influences on meaning that seem to entail that natural language is not strictly compositional. But Fodor argued that thought must be compositional as well, meaning that it must have this constituent structure where atomic representations are combined according to a certain syntax into complex representations, such that when we think of complex representations, say I think of John loves Mary, I am co-tokening atomic representations that, like the representation of John, within that complex representation, and therefore it has this discrete constituent structure. It is made up of these more atomic representations. So this is easy to account for in a classical symbolic system, like the good old-fashioned AI systems, in which essentially that's what you have. You have symbolic, you have atomic symbols that can be combined into complex symbolic representations according to that has certain syntax, and the symbols are arbitrary. They have arbitrary shapes, but they can receive semantic interpretation. So he made an empirical claim, which is that connectionist systems, artificial neural networks, are not capable in principle of achieving the kind of compositional behavior we see in humans, including, say, systematicity and productivity, unless they are literally implementing a classical architecture. So unless they are just, this what at the time some people called implementational connectionism, unless they're literally implementing something like a classical architecture with this constituent structure. So that's the empirical claim. I would argue that this empirical claim is more or less at this point disproven. I think that the recent progress of deep learning has more or less shown that you can read. I mean, I was just talking about this compositional generalization benchmarks. The results are still a bit of a mixed bag, depending on how what you think of these tricks on transformers that achieve greater generalization. But still, even looking at the fact that language models can generate perfectly grammatical sentences of virtually any kind, this puts a lot of pressure on this empirical claim. And then there's a further claim, which is that there's a related claim that the only way to achieve the kind of compositional behavior you see in humans is to have that kind of discrete constituent structure, and that the ways to try to get compositionality out of a non-implementational connectionist system are just doomed to fail. So that's a claim that's interesting to explore in light of the non-classical form of compositionality I think one finds in modern deep learning system. And then he made a claim about another claim about the way in which compositional performance is the mechanisms that support it in humans and in human cognition, arguing that that is supported by this kind of language of thought with this kind of discrete constituent structure. I think that claim is not directly threatened by the recent progress of language models, because it's a claim about human cognition, and just because language models can achieve something in one way doesn't mean that humans achieve it in the same way. So it takes a little bit more work to suggest that this is not what's going on in the human case either. And I think looking at deep learning models can help sharpen discussions about this specifically about human cognition. But now I want to come to the Bigbench task that you mentioned, which is I collaborated with some colleagues. So Bigbench is this massive collaborative benchmark that was spearheaded by people like Google AI. And what was interesting is that they explicitly appealed to people working in other disciplines, including linguists, psychologists, and philosophers, to contribute specific tasks to this benchmark. And it's made up of a huge amount of tasks, over 100 tasks, I think. So with some colleagues, we designed a task that was designed to see whether language models can parse novel conceptual combination. So we took inspiration here from the work of Gregory Murphy and Brendan Lake in psychology. And so humans are very good at understanding novel conceptual combinations that come from just putting together two concepts. So if I tell you about an apartment dog, you will know right away what kind of dog I'm talking about. You will know, first of all, that it's not an apartment with dog-like features. It's a dog that relates to apartment in certain ways. You will be able to visualize that it's probably a small dog, because in an apartment, typically a dog needs to be on the small side. You might be able to infer various features of that kind of dog based on the meaning of your understanding of the two concepts, apartment and dog, as well as some background knowledge about apartments and dogs. It's interesting, though, it's not totally syntax free, because the order in which you combine concepts does matter. So, for example, a factory car is not the same as a car factory. And a factory car is a car made in factories. A car factory is not a factory made in cars. So there are these subtle, very complex. A factory car is a car made in factories. A car factory is not a factory made in cars. It's the factory in which the cars are made. And so there's some interesting work in linguistics, actually trying to systematize the different ways in which we combine nouns into phrasal nouns like this. It's extremely complex. But my point is like, this is not totally syntax free because the order in which you combine these nouns into phrasal nouns actually matters to the way in which we parse them. But it's not strictly compositional because there's a lot of background world knowledge that comes into the interpretation of the combination. But anyway, in this task, we designed it with several subtasks, and we decided to avoid precisely the problem that you mentioned, which is that deep learning models tend to use the lazy route if they can and just latch onto shallow heuristics to solve a given problem. So one of the ways we went around this is that we had some subtasks that use only made-up words that are defined in the prompt. So we just use totally made-up words and say, a bean is a type of animal with 4 legs, and a BAM is a type of dwelling. What is a bean BAM? And well, actually, we say which of the 4 following sentences is the most coherent use of the concept bean BAM. And then we have 4 sentences, and one of the sentences might be talking about dogs, going into dog houses and dogs, for example. But we also, so we don't just use made-up words that the model has never encountered. We also use distractors. So, for example, here's a toy example. If you take the conceptual combination burning questions, among the 4 sentences that the model has to consider as that all use the phrase burning questions, we included sentences that like burning questions are blazing hot, or burning questions are on fire. That if the model was just latching onto shallow heuristics about burning and the context in which burning appears, that might trick the model into giving the wrong answer.
Could I just push on that a tiny bit, because you spoke about apartment dog, and apartment is something that is grounded to things in its training data, and dog is something which is grounded to things in its training data, and then it combines them together. I know you don't like stitching and gluing, but we'll use that in the most generous way possible. Mm-hmm. But it feels like, it doesn't surprise me that it has a competence at doing that. The thing that it doesn't have a competence at doing is things which are not grounded either with the real world or with things in the training data. So, for example, I'm sure you've seen if you generate a DALL-E image of salmon in a river, it shows you the salmon from the supermarket swimming in the river, right? Or if you ask it to generate a woman on top of the world, now on top of the world means that she's feeling great, but it would probably just generate, like a woman on top of planet Earth or something like that. So do you see what I mean? It's these hidden meta relations that it's got no chance of understanding.
Well, I think there are a few things to say here. First of all, I don't think anything that goes for language models translates to vision language models, and certainly not all of them. So DALL-E 2, I've taken issue with a number of claims that are made about compositionality in deep learning generally, or even in text-to-image models generally, based on examples from DALL-E 2, because it's trained with this contrastive learning objective that it looks at these image caption pairs, and during training it's fed both pairs and image and captions that go together and pairs that don't go together, and the objective is to bring close together in the latent space the vector representations of image captions that actually go together, and further apart the ones that don't go together. And there are I think pretty good reasons to think that this kind of learning objective will not get a model to induce a lot of information about syntactic structure of language, because you can do that task without having to induce that information, just because, first of all, if you look at a typical caption for an image, it does not include very complex syntactic structure that involve complex relations, such as there is so for example, even spatial relations. So like there is a woman to the right of a wardrobe. The wardrobe is to the left of a table and things like that. We'll just say a picture of a woman with a wardrobe and a table. So already, if you don't even have that information in the caption that are used in the training data, you by definition cannot learn it. And then doing this contrastive learning, you can do that by just more or less latching onto keywords instead of so you can have almost just a bag of words approach to the kind of linguistic description of an image, and that's mostly sufficient to discriminate between captions that go and don't go with images. So I'm not surprised that DALL-E 2 fails at say drawing a blue cube on top of a red cube. If you look at other models like Parsi and other models that use frozen pre-trained language models as the text encoder instead of clip, they do much better at this kind of thing. So that's the first thing I would say is I would be a little bit careful about what, looking at just what DALL-E cannot do. And then, I don't really remember, the woman on top of the world, I mean, humans also need to learn. Being on top of the world is an idiom, right? So humans need to learn what that means. If you talk to a child that has never encountered that idiom about a person on top of the world, or ask them to draw that, I'm pretty sure they would draw someone on top of a planet, something like that.
I would argue that it is still an analogy. So on top of, we have a natural sense of levels of happiness or levels of status, and being on top of something is definitely an analogy. I think it's something which could be, because the whole point of a metaphor, sort of using the language from Douglas Hofstadter, is it's just a wonderful vehicle to kind of convey understanding through, like you said, that analogy making is the kind of interstate freeway of how our brain works. And I think I could say to someone, she's on top of the world. And if that person had never heard that phrase before, she would understand what I meant.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting empirical question. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think it definitely is. The idiom comes from some kind of analogy or metaphor. That's beyond dispute. But I think then it just kind of entered into common language. And I don't think when people learn that expression or use it, they are actively thinking about the analogy necessarily, right? So it just becomes a way to say that someone is very happy and a shorthand for that. But even, granting you that point, you can, you can get language models to do various forms of analogical reasoning. It's actually really remarkable the extent to which you can do that. I recently saw someone posting an example with the new Bing chat that people speculate might be a lot more advanced model than GPT 3.5. Who knows? It does seem like it has some more advanced capacities in some respects. And one thing that's fun to do with Bing chat that this user was pointing out is that you can prompt it to do a comparison table between two completely different things that have nothing to do with two different entities that are not even at the same level of abstraction or have nothing to do with each other. So that particular example was make a table comparing the features or the specs of like a specific Nokia phone and Jesus Christ. And the model generated this table that, first of all, is quite funny, but it's also quite witty in the way it's drawing analogies. So it's saying, I can't remember the detail, but every line is really an instance of an analogical reasoning. So there was one that was indestructibility. So the Nokia 3310 is known for being really hard to break. It was a phone that was really sturdy. Likewise, Jesus Christ is you could say is indestructible because it was resurrected. Or the resurrection bit as well. There was a line that was about the Nokia 3310 was brought back recently by Nokia. There was a new it's sold again, so it's been resurrected by Nokia. Jesus Christ was also resurrected. There was something about display that talked about the display of the Nokia and what we know about potential physical features of Jesus Christ. And it goes on and on and on. And, it's very striking when you look at it. And I don't see how that's not an instance of analogical reasoning of some form.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose the criticism would be, is it just selecting meta relations which have already been created by humans, or is it genuinely creating new ones?
So I mean, that's something one could easily investigate by looking up Nokia 3310 Jesus Christ on the internet. I mean, who knows what people have said on the internet, but this was just not just an isolated example. Then people tried the same template with the most absurd, absurdly unrelated concepts, and it works very well. So I don't know. My hunch looking at this is that it is latching onto analogical and relationships.
Yeah, it's like the miracle that humans have is we can take any two objects. I mean, I can kind of like pick up a battery and I can pick up a can of Coke, and I can find a meta relation between them, right? They're both grabbable, or they're both solid or something like that. And there are an infinite number of possible meta relations, and we can grab and select one. And then through the language game or whatever, I communicate it to you, you can infer what I mean, and then it just kind of becomes established in language. It's a miracle
Right.
how it works. But I wanted to move on to symbol grounding a little bit, because I know you've got some things to say about that. And Stephen Harned actually wrote this paper called The Symbol Grounding Problem, I think several decades ago. And he said it's the problem of how to make semantic interpretation of a formal symbol system intrinsic to the system rather than just parasitic on the meaning in our heads. And he spoke about ungrounded symbols, which are manipulated by rules based on their shape, and grounded symbols, which are connected to things that they stand through a causal chain of sensory projections and motor actions. So, yeah, why don't you kind of introduce the symbol grounding problem, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because, as you say, this old problem has been resurrected in recent discussions of language models. But I think the way in which people talk about grounding when it comes to language models is somewhat obfuscated by the way in which different notions of grounding might be conflated. So the core notion of grounding, I think, is what I would call referential grounding. Which is the idea that many people talking about language models are concerned with, namely this idea that their representations and encodings of lexical items, of words or linguistic expressions, are not grounded in their reference in the world, because they don't have direct access to the world, but only have access to linguistic information. So that's one notion of grounding. It's even before Harnad, Barbara Party, the linguist, had kind of coined the phrase language to world grounding to refer to this particular notion. When people talk about grounding, though, sometimes they mean something different. So sometimes they mean something like what I would call sensory motor grounding. And I think Harnad himself kind of equivocates a little bit between these two things. Sensory motor grounding will be connecting linguistic representations to representations in other modalities, such as perceptual and motor representations. So this is what people have in mind when they say that vision language models like DALL-E 2 are grounded. They are grounded in the sense that they encode linguistic and visual information in the same vector space. And so in that process, they establish connections between representations of different modalities. But that doesn't mean they're referentially grounded, right? That only means they're grounded in that other sense, which is sensory motor grounding.
Many people have argued for years that all we need is multimodality, and we'll speak about the multimodal language model actually as well in a minute. But Harnad did basically say he I don't think he used the word inactivism, but he was basically saying that, if only we could have robots who actually had physical affordances in the real world, then suddenly the symbol grounding problem wouldn't be an issue anymore. But surely there's so much more to it than that, just along the lines that we've been speaking to.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you just have to look at old school classical robotic systems, or even CHRDLU in the blocks world. you could argue, again, as I mentioned earlier, that the representation of CHRDLU are grounded referentially in the sense that the symbols, the linguistic symbols it uses, like red block, are anchored onto, are connected to representations of virtual objects in the virtual blocks world. But it's not intrinsic grounding in Harnet's sense, right? And I think that the key point that Harnet is concerned with is that this grounding needs to be intrinsic and not projected onto these systems by semantic interpretation given by the programmers. But the other thing I would point out is that you could have so the point about causal interaction with the world comes apart from the point about multimodality in a way that I think there is even a double dissociation there. So you can have models like DALL-E 2 that are trained on multimodal data, so they're trained on text and images, but they're trained on multimodal data in the purely passive way because they just learn like all these transformer models at training time from this stream of data they're sampling from the data set in this purely passive way. There is no interaction there. Vice versa, you could imagine a system that's purely linguistic, but that actually learns from interaction with humans, for example, through dialogue. So you can imagine a language model that instead of being trained passively through next word prediction, actually gets trained. I don't know what the learning objective would be, but would get trained through dialogue. It would be very impractical because you would probably need many thousands of years for that system to get any good, and it would just output gibberish for the first hundreds of years or something. But you could kind of conceptually think of a system that interacts with the world in a purely linguistic manner. So I think these two things do come apart. But then grounding is also used in other ways. So people talk about, even in the Climbing Towards NLU paper, Emily Bender and Alex Kohler talk about grounding sometimes in ways that relates to communicative intent. So some people talk about grounding linguistic representations in communicative intent. That's yet something else, right? So you have a system that might not have communicative intent and yet has representations that are referentially grounded in the world and or sensory motorly grounded in other modalities.
Yeah. I think we'll get to that in a minute when we speak about the theory of mind stuff.
Yeah. So all of these things I think are good to keep separate, and there are yet other senses of grounding. I don't have to get into that, but I think the interesting point is that it's not entirely obvious to me that even text-only language models can't achieve some very, very limited form of referential grounding. This is why when I mentioned earlier that, they have a pretty significant form of inferential lexical competence. But they might also have some degree of a referential lexical competence. First of all, you can think of certain domains that might not require a direct connection to the world in order to ground linguistic expressions. So one example would be the very concept of a word. It might be just possible just by, being trained on words or on linguistic expressions. You can think of the concept of a token, or if you don't want, because of course language models only see tokens, not words, and tokenization might be at the subword level. But just think of the concept of a token. Then that's a concept where you could think, well, actually, just living in this text-only world is enough to kind of have some form of referential grounding of your use of the term token. Or you could think of certain logical concepts. The concept of a conjunction, things like that. It's debatable. You could argue, well, actually, even these concepts are grounded in some kinds of interaction with the world in humans, but I'm not sure that would apply to all of these sorts of concepts. I think there might be concepts that can be grounded in a text. Yeah,
I can give you many. I mean, I can look at event semantics, or this is something Walid Sabah says about these cognitive templates that are not grounded in the physical universe. They would they would still exist even if the universe didn't exist, like located at or contains in. These things are not grounded in physical reality.
Yeah, so I mean, some psychologists would say, well, they are related to more concrete concepts that are grounded, and they are just abstracted away from these concepts, but they are indirectly grounded in this way. But that's interesting, because if you go down that route, then that brings me to my second point, which is, how is to say that the text-only language models don't also have some representations that are indirectly grounded through the mediation of language into the interactions with the world that humans had in order to produce the text on which they're trained. So the training data of these large language models encodes a lot of implicit structure about the world that is reflected in the structure of language. And this is actually provable. There's some really great work by Ali Pavlik, for example, looking at, and her colleagues looking at the fact that you can find isomorphisms between representations of color concepts in language models and the actual structure of the color space, like Ciela, about different ways to represent color space and relationship between colors. So you can map one onto the other. Yeah.
But that's phenomenology, and is that not orthogonal to what goes on in a language model?
Well, I mean, what do you mean? So, I mean, you could conceivably think that language models can induce a lot of information about experience just by being trained on a lot of text that talks about experience, right? So it's not that baffling to me that it would just learn certain structural properties of experience, human experience.
Yeah, we spoke earlier about those different categories, and there's the kind of, I guess that would be ontologically subjective. And that to me is the category which is just divorced from language models. I can't understand how it could possibly learn anything about that. But what do you think?
I think there are two papers that look at color spaces. You have some representations of color spaces that are not perceptually accurate. So there are ways, like standard color spaces that are used for color, for color grading, or might not actually reflect exactly the way in which humans perceive colors. So the color representations of language models are grounded in that wouldn't necessarily entail anything about inducing information about the kind of structure or experiential space of human experience. But there is one paper that looks at CLab specifically, which I think is a perceptually accurate color space.
Could it be that we've almost got the causation the wrong way round? I mean, if that is the case, then maybe, and I'm sure they've done studies on this, the way we perceive color might be determined by the concepts, the symbols, the reality, and so on. So it's that level of directionality.
Yeah, I think there is pretty good evidence that that's not the case. So the whole Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about language heavily influencing the way in which we perceive the world, I think has been mostly discredited if you look at cross-cultural evidence.
Interesting.
So I don't think that's a straightforward explanation. But here is another piece of evidence. So not about experience, but about these isomorphisms that I'm interested in. So there's another paper that showed that I think it's called "Do Language Models Know the Way to Rome?" And it's looking at whether language models, their encodings of spatial, location words, like specifically looking at names of cities like Rome, Paris, London, and so on, is isomorphic to the actual spatial relationships within these cities. And they do find this isomorphism. So that's also interesting. It suggests that, they can actually induce meaningful information about the structure of the real world that is reflected in the structure of the corpus, because the corpus is produced by humans who interact with the real world.
But that's saying something very deep, because you were speaking about Firth and the distributional hypothesis earlier, and there's actually studies in humans with the medial temporal lobe that if you show them images together in a certain order, then there's a topology which is formed in the brain, which represents the kind of the structure of how you showed them the information. But this is all pointing to there are many different paths to form a representation. We're naturally skeptical of the distributional hypothesis, right? Because it's analogous to what you were saying earlier, that large language models, they just predict the next token and the next token. But then you just gave an example with phenomenology, that what actually emerges in the brain is something which is, almost exactly as we would expect it to. And it seems completely counterintuitive to us that using this very naive way of constructing this topology would actually produce the right representation, but it does.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that. I would say that distributional semantics is definitely an important part of the semantics of words. So I would just say that it's not it's not the whole story. But again, thinking of it more in terms of the kind of competence that we need to understand word meaning, I think we need both inferential and referential competence. So we need both the ability to relate words together in ways that support material inference. That's the inferential bit, and that's the one that language models are pretty good at. And we also need to be able to name things in the world, respond to instructions, to do things in the world. Which, by the way, there is work by Google AI, for example, the Say-Can series of papers where they plug language models onto robots that can actually do things in the world. So that's another piece of evidence that's interesting to discuss. And there's also this various papers about world models in language models. And one of the recent one that caught my attention is one about the GPT model trained on the Othello game. I don't know if you came across that paper.
Oh, no.
So it's a GPT model that's trained from scratch only on linguistic descriptions of moves in the game Othello, which is such that, just in terms of combinatorial possibilities, it would be completely impossible for a language model to learn how to play Othello just by brute memorization. And what's interesting is that after training, the model is actually able to predict plausible next moves for any given state of the game, which again is very hard to explain in terms of brute memorization. It's pretty much absurd. But also, you can change the internal representation of the model to change the predicted move to a different move. And there is ongoing follow-up work now to use tools for mechanistic interpretability to actually look at the attention heads and see whether we can reverse engineer the computations that are induced by this model to predict Othello moves. But that's another piece of evidence that's interesting, that suggests that language models can actually learn a world model, at least in these very simple toy game cases, that goes much beyond just this basic idea of next token prediction as just being autocomplete, right?
But it comes back to this notion of what does it mean to understand? It's like was it the fourth game with AlphaGo where it just produced a train of terrible moves because it got into a delusional state. It's what Christopher Summerfield calls the Swiss cheese phenomenon, where sometimes you're in a hole in the Swiss cheese and it goes completely bananas and it starts hallucinating and going crazy. And it's a similar thing with this example you just gave. You can also get ChatGPT to play chess. And it doesn't have an abstract model of chess. So Gary Marcus would say, well, if it doesn't have an abstract model of the world, then it's not a world model at all. But of course, it is a world model, but it's a very kind of I don't know whether you'd call it a high resolution or a low resolution model, but it's a surface model of the world.
So ChatGPT is terrible at chess. Actually, the Bing Chat is pretty good at chess. So there's recent.
Really?
Yeah. It can. There's recent experiments showing that it can output, just based on a sequence of moves, legal moves in the vast majority of cases, and it can actually play a decent game of chess. But the problem is with this is that it's harder to control for memorization, even though, again, the combinations are so crazy, potential combinations, potential states of a game of a game of chess are so crazy high that numerous that it's difficult to see how it could do this with just brute force memorization. But the thing that's nice about the Othello GPT paper is that it's really training the model from scratch, only on Othello moves. And of course, the model never has any access to the actual board game of Othello. And what's interesting is that the researcher Kenneth Lee, who I think it was Kenneth Lee who did that work, looked at also the internal representations of the model and showed that you can actually reconstitute the topology of a game of Othello, of the board, by projecting internal representations, which is kind of wild. But yeah, again, there's something going on here that's more than just focusing on the next token. And I think mechanistic interpretability is the key to get at that.
I wanted to talk about theory of mind with you, Raphael, because you're probably, out of all of the people in the world that I could speak to, you're probably the best person to speak to about this. But yeah, so language models are powerful tools for natural language processing, but they're often treated as black boxes that generate or process text without understanding their meaning or purpose, as we've just been discussing. And so this theory of mind thing is quite interesting here, because we treat language models, we could treat them as agents which can infer and manipulate the mental states of other agents in the world, reasoning about their goals and beliefs and actions. And there's an interesting paper I read yesterday, actually, called Computational Language Acquisition with Theory of Mind from Andy Liu et al. I'm not sure if you've spoken about that, but they built a model which used an internal listener to simulate how a teacher would interpret its utterances, and an internal teacher model to infer the teacher's goals and intentions. And I've looked a little bit around on this, and there seems to be 3 approaches for modeling theory of mind. There's false belief tasks, pragmatic models, and these internal listener models. So that's kind of like my perspective on this. But give us your take on how we can build models with a theory of mind, which is to say, to reason about the beliefs and intentions of others.
Yeah, so that's a hot topic right now. Can language models develop some kind of theory of mind? I haven't read this preprint you just mentioned. I've seen it pop up, actually. I haven't read it yet, but I think it's generally quite hard to conclusively establish that language models have induced something like a theory of mind. Because if you just test it on standard theory of mind tests, the things that we might use with animals, it's really hard to rule out. But obviously, linguistic versions of these tasks. It's really hard to rule out that the model is not just solving these based on other statistical patterns that really don't involve any inferences about the mental states of an agent. There is this interesting preprint by Jacob Andrus called Language Models as Agent Models that makes a pretty strong claim, namely that, we know that language models have this remarkable ability to kind of embody various possible agents in the way they speak, in the way they generate text. Actually, this is why in this piece I published last summer in Nautilus, I said that it's maybe more accurate to call them stochastic chameleons than stochastic parrots. Brilliant. But so Jacob kind of builds on that idea and say, well, really what's happening there when you prompt a model is that it's going to settle on the simulation of a particular agent in the way in which you will generate answers. A particular agent with particular beliefs and goals. So, for example, if you tell it you are an expert, I don't know, like bird scientist, and you know every fact there is about birds, and then you ask it a question about birds, it will tend to give factually accurate answers because you've prompted it in that way. And it can do through in-context learning. It can, which by the way has been shown to be equivalent to a virtual form of fine-tuning. You could see that as being, on Jacob's view, is that you could see that as kind of zooming in on perhaps a specific part of latent space, or that is equivalent to simulating an agent that is an expert birdwatcher or something along these lines, with certain background beliefs and knowledge and goals. So I actually had an exchange about this with Jacob, but I'm skeptical that you can easily establish this because there's a much more deflationary hypothesis, which is simply that what you can do by prompting the model through this in-context learning is just get the model to essentially mimic the style and linguistic quirks of a particular agent whose outputs was reflected in the training data. But there's a lot of daylight between that claim and the claim that they're literally simulating agents with goals, beliefs, and desires and background knowledge. So think of the stylistic case. So if you prime a model, if you prompt a model to write in the style of Jane Austen, even vanilla GPT-3 is very good at that. It will output paragraphs in the style of Jane Austen. I think it would be quite strange to say that it's simulating Jane Austen, or the simulating being the agent Jane Austen with Jane Austen's background, beliefs, desires, and so on, and ideas about literature and style. It's doing something that seems much simpler than that. And I think the same can be applied to other examples. So a recent case was the whole fiasco around Bing Chat in Sydney, where people figured out that the original version of Bing Chat, if you prompted it in a certain way, had this weird antagonistic behavior. That's actually not that weird when you look at the transcript. So if you look at the Kevin Roos piece and the transcripts, there's a lot of leading prompts and priming in the prompts that bring up Jungian ideas about the dark self and so on, and that obviously primed the model to act out as this kind of fictional character. Was it simulating the Sydney, the dark double of the good Bing Chat? I don't think so. I think it's just engaging in this kind of creative fiction exercise that can be analyzed in terms of statistical patterns for the kind of language user or linguistic community that you've primed it to emulate. That's not quite the same as literally simulating mental states like beliefs, desires, and background knowledge.
I mean, I read that article on Less Wrong by Janice, about simulators, and I do actually quite love this idea that language models have agentiveness, and there's a kind of simulator and a simulacrum, and it can embody many different people at the same time. But I guess I was going to ask you, how does the theory of mind relate to other cognitive abilities in language models? I mean, we've been teasing apart. By the way, Shanahan spoke about the intentional stance. When I spoke with Floridi, he's actually amazing. He's invented this philosophy of information. He gave me an example of a Michelangelo, like someone in the street can paint it on the concrete, but it's not a Michelangelo. It might have the same aesthetic, might have the same technique, but you've got all of these other things. You've got the subjective experience, you've got the intention, you've got the purpose, you've got the semantics. You've got so much stuff there, and it's the same thing with theory of mind to a certain extent. So we could just argue, if you just scale up the model size and the data quality and change the fine tuning and the pre-training objectives, then all of a sudden this thing will emerge. But to me, it fundamentally feels like a little bit extra. And also, I'm interested, you would, as you just said, symbol grounding is required for natural language understanding, but surely a theory of mind should be requisite for things like common sense and, reasoning and causal inference and counterfactual thinking and even meta-learning. It feels very important, but I have this fundamental question of, can it even exist?
Yeah, so I'm not totally convinced that theory of mind is needed for some of the things you mentioned, like common sense reasoning. You can reason about what happens when I push a ball off a table without being able to throw inferences about the mental states of other agents, I think. But so to kind of contextualize how theory of mind relates to issues about language, it basically relates to this whole other aspect of language use, which is pragmatics and the kind of Gricean tradition in linguistics, looking at the ways in which we interpret the meaning of expressions, of utterances in conversation that go beyond simply parsing the strict linguistic meaning of a sentence, regardless of the context in which it's uttered, but also draw upon extra linguistic information and inferences, including inferences about what the other language user, what the person I'm talking to, is trying to convey. And Grice delineated various principles that seem to apply to communication and the way in which it works in humans and perhaps some non-human animals is that it seems that we are trying to triangulate on a common ground in the way we understand terms in communication in ways that involves, first of all, having an intent to communicate oneself, communicative intent, and modeling the other person's intent to communicate with oneself. But in fact, Gricean pragmatics goes all the way to something like third degree theory of mind, where I draw inferences about what I think that you think that I want to communicate. So this kind of really complex, higher order inferences about mental states. On a side note, there is actually, I was at this psychology and philosophy meeting last summer, and there was this interesting poster about these experiments on Alex the gray parrot, which is a famous animal subject. In animal cognition, there's this gray parrot called Alex that was tested on its ability to engage in various forms of linguistic behavior, because of course parrots can utter words. And what's ironic is that parrots are extremely intelligent creatures, such that the stochastic parrot's analogy is perhaps not the insult or the inflationary claim that it's meant to be. And what was interesting in this poster was suggesting that perhaps Alex the Grey Parrot had some form of third degree theory of mind and had communicative intent, because there is this one episode where the Alex wanted, well, that's an interpretation, but was presented with fruits that he wasn't particularly happy to eat. So the fruits that it was able to name was bananas and berries, I think. And there was this whole interaction where the parrot was gesturing at an apple and started calling it, or I don't want to put too much interpretation on the case, but started at least uttering banary, which is a combination of banana and berry, right? And repeatedly saying banary until he was brought the apple, and then ate the apple and stopped saying binary. And so...
So Emily was right then. It was just stitching and gluing.
Well, I mean, this is very... if you want to really interpret this as an intent to communicate the desire to eat the apple by coining a new word, that's really, really sophisticated. And that's definitely hints at parrots being way more sophisticated language users than they're given credit for in the traditional stochastic parrots piece.
Indeed.